Hello everybody, my name is Barry Lacey and I'm the historian in residence with Wexford County Council as part of our Decade of Centenaries. And today I'm going to be bringing you a talk entitled From Truce to Treaty. And we're going to be discussing the events of 100 years ago, from the end of the War of Independence when a truce was announced in July 1921 and the period leading up through the treaty, which was signed on the 6th of December of the same year. On the 11th of July 1921, a truce was signed, which essentially brought an end to hostilities and an end to the Irish War of Independence, which had been a conflict raging on since early 1919. And towards the end of the period in County Wexford, we saw an increase in activity. There was 3 Coast Guard stations burned, attempted ambushes in RIC, and the last military activity was when 2 police officers in Timon were surrounded and disarmed of their weapons in the July of that year also. But with this truce brought certain obligations on both sides. It included an end to hostilities, an end to military displays, and it brought about certain freedoms which had been taken away under martial law. Wexford being one of the counties which was under these tight restrictions. So normal life began to, or somewhat normal, began to return to people after nearly 2 years, more than 2 years of hostility. So it was a very welcomed time and a very welcomed break, and there were celebrations. Men who had been on the run for a long time were able to return home to their families and loved ones. Safe houses, which were often hideaways for men who were on the run, were able to open their doors, and people were able to mingle freely without worry of the violence which had previously been in the country. Now, what can we look at to give us an understanding of what was going on during the truce period in County Wexford? Because a lot of people will think of the Irish War of Independence and then jump immediately, I suppose, towards the Irish Civil War and think of the treaty beforehand. But in the months of June, July, August, September, October, November, and December, there were incidents of conflicts in County Wexford and of both sides, I suppose, trying to go about the routines of governing the country. With the truce came an opportunity for the IRA to be seen more than out in public. For the years of the War of Independence, they had been mostly using guerrilla warfare, a hidden army of the Republic, whereas now they had the opportunity to freely go among the people and do their duties. And one of the duties they undertook was just general policing in the area. And you read references from many sources with regards to the activities that they did. Some of the resources that I've been able to use for this talk are the newspapers, the Enniscorthy Guardian and the New Ross Standard, and also copies of the Truce liaison papers. And during the truce period, liaison officers were set up in different counties. Wexford would have had its own, then Carlow, Kilkenny, Waterford, and so on and so on. And the idea of these liaison officers was that they were to collaborate with the general headquarters and communicate with the local district inspector or the RIC, and with regards to obligations of the truce and whether there was breaches of the truce and just general communication. And they were essentially people that you would go to where if you think there was breaches of the truce or breaches of the peace, and they would try and sort it out or figure out what was going on. And with regard to the general policing, you come across a couple of instances in the newspapers from the time. The New Ross Standard reported on the 21st of October 1921 how the IRA did a fantastic job at keeping the racecourse clear during the races in Enniscorthy. And in that instance, they were referred to as the IRA police. And there is another somewhat comical incident of the IRA policing which took place the month previously. The New Ross Standard reported on the 23rd of September 1921 how volunteers had been visiting public houses in the Shelburne and Hook areas of the county, so down south, and they were making sure that they were staying within their closing hours. And in one instance, they visited a public house where they found that the men were staying beyond the opening hours that were allowed. So they were warned and told to leave, but when they came back, they found that they had actually remained inside the pub. So as a punishment, they put them in a motor car and they brought them a distance away and detained them for the night. And the following morning, the men were made walk home. And I could imagine that that was a punishment that stayed with them for quite some time. Now, it would be wrong to think that the truce period in Wexford and indeed Ireland passed off peacefully without any incident. If you look at the newspaper accounts from the time, as well as the liaison reports and those from the local RIC district inspector, you do come across incidents where the two opposing forces, the British and the IRA, came into conflict. One such example took place in September 1921 when a volunteer or IRA patrol was making their way through Gorey town, and they had passed barracks when their official report in the newspaper states that they were fired upon twice by a patrol of RIC officers, and in the subsequent altercation that took place, two of them were captured and badly beaten. The newspaper reports state that the police didn't give any official account, but there was rumours that they were patrolling the town and that they didn't recognise the men as volunteers and that they failed to stop when they were asked to do so. Another incident took place in that year in October on a lesser violent scale. Sean Etchingham, who was a Sinn Féin elected official, was to address a meeting of his followers in Owlet village, and he was approached by the local RIC sergeant, who said that this was against the truce and it was an illegal gathering and that he had special permission to break it up if needed be. Sean Etchingham didn't take any note of this and continued on with his speech and with the meeting, and while the RIC looked on from a distance. So there was tension between both sides during the period, and because a couple of months previously, these men had been fighting each other. So although a peace did exist, it was at times a very fragile peace. Now, during the truce period, both the British and the Irish authorities had to coexist together, and sometimes this might have led to a bit of confusion among the civilian population. And one example is this from the Truce liaison papers from November 1921, when what was referred to as the enemy military in Enniscorthy had notified civilians that their motors will be seized for refusal to pay road licence. Some of the members of the public subsequently inquired of the local IRA member about this, and he said that you can continue to avoid paying your road licence by all means, but that he couldn't guarantee that their motor vehicles wouldn't be seized. So you can see this in one instance as, is it a genuine maybe confusion with regards to administration between the civilian population, or were they using the situation that was existing at the time to try and get out of having to pay their road license? We can leave this open to interpretation. Now, in October of 1921, there was reports in the local newspapers how the police decided to consolidate their forces. During the War of Independence, many rural RIC barracks had been closed and were subsequently vacated by the police and then burned by the IRA or sabotaged so that they couldn't be used by either the RIC or the new arriving forces of the Black and Tans and later the auxiliaries. So during the War of Independence, you only had a couple of urban barracks that were still being garrisoned, for example, in the major towns such as Wexford, Enniscorthy, New Ross, and then in more rural villages like Timon and Ferns, for example. But during the truce period, one of the agreements was that there wouldn't be any new forces arriving into the country. So essentially, a lot of the members of the military and the police were taken away from the rural barracks such as Ferns and Timon, and they were consolidated together in the larger barracks. So again, you had a reduction in I suppose the presence of the British authorities in many parts of the county at the time. Some of the stations that were closed, including the New Ross district, where the members of the barracks in Duncannon were taken and transferred to New Ross. Similarly, in the Enniscorthy district, Ferns and Bunclody were closed and the garrison sent to Enniscorthy, and while Ferns and Owlert and the garrisons there were sent to Gorey. And of course, in the south of the county, Carrig, Folks Mills, and Timon barracks were closed, likely sent to Wexford. What interesting to note that Bridgetown, they were sent to Rosslare, which was quite a rural barracks, but the significance of its location beside a busy port meant that it was still going to be manned by police. And interestingly, to coincide with this, while you see a reduction of the British forces, or rather the consolidation into more into the urban areas, you see an increase in IRA camps opening up. There's references to camps opening up in the north and the south of the county where the IRA openly trained, did drills, learned about cleaning weapons, firing, and so on, and made use of these peaceful times. So while you see the British forces consolidating their men, you see the IRA using the opportunity to open training camps, and there is incidents where these were reported and they were seen as breaches of the truce, but I suppose people did use the opportunities that they had at the time. Now, we spoke previously about how during the truce period in Ireland, fragile coexistence was in place between the IRA and the British authorities, but allegiances were brought into question on lesser scales during the period, away from the bullet and the bomb, but in the general running of the county. And one such incident was reported in the New Ross Standard in November of 1921, when a Dr. Furlong, who was a surgeon in the local in the county infirmary, and refused to give evidence in a Republican court into the inquest of the death of a little girl. And he did this because his conscience, he said, wouldn't allow him, as he held the honorary rank of captain in the British Army. And in the subsequent meetings that followed, the issue was resolved. Well, it just goes to show how this fragile coexistence also affected not just the military forces, but also the administration of the county as well. Now, while there were many conditions surrounding the truce from July 1921, some members of the Wexford IRA thought they would utilise the peacetime to increase their stock of weapons. Weapons, or a lack of, was an ongoing issue for the IRA during the War of Independence. So Francis Cartney, in his witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, given several decades after the events, refers to how they decided to utilise these peace times to import weapons. And this is also mentioned in the operations or of the brigade activity reports from South Wexford, where it says arrangements were being made for the running of a cargo of arms from Wales. 30 rifles and some small arms were subsequently secured. And the following went across to Wales and carried out the rails at Salisbury's Plain military camp. Now, Francis further illuminates on this incident, where he says that previous contact had been made with a sergeant over in Wales, and they subsequently managed to obtain an amount of rifles and bring them back to the southeast for use. During the War of Independence in County Wexford, the IRA was divided into a North Wexford Brigade and a South Wexford Brigade, and the two would have cooperated and fought together during the period. But the truce allowed for a bit of friendly rivalry between both, and a IRA challenge match in hurling and football GA was to take place between both brigades on the 27th of November 1921. Due to bad weather, it was postponed until the 11th of December, but when it did occur, the South Wexford Volunteers came out the better team, winning in both the hurling and the football. The final score in the hurling was 3-1 to 1 goal, and in the football it was 1-1 to 2 points. And this is an interesting event because in the months previously during the War of Independence, it would have been unheard of for possibly an event like this, a public gathering, perhaps, but especially when you consider the men who were taking part. Many of these men could have previously been on the run, but here they were now playing a public match to a public audience in a public arena. And there's another side to the story as well when you consider that little did they know that a few months later on, during the Irish Civil War, which broke out in June 1922, many of these men may have taken different sides and been fighting against each other. And it just brings home, I suppose, the reality regarding this period in history. On the 6th of December 1921, the Anglo Irish Treaty was signed by members of the delegation sent over from Ireland, of which included Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith, and it would later be passed by a majority of Dáil Éireann. But in the subsequent weeks that followed, much division would appear, which would eventually culminate in the beginning of the Irish Civil War in June of 1922. For some people, the treaty was an opportunity for peace, a stepping stone to the Republic, while for others it was a betrayal of the Republic. They thought many people who had fought and died for the Republic, and that the treaty wasn't worthy of that sacrifice. And it's important to understand the history from this period because it would shape the country in which we live in today, in 2021. And I hope this brief presentation has allowed you to learn and reflect on the events of 100 years ago that took place in our country. And I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to listen.